On this episode of Newt's World, thousands of Germans gathered at the Berlin Wall on November 9th, 1989, and began to tear it down. The act of tearing down the wall was the symbolic end of the collapse of the Soviet Union and communist rule of East Berlin, and began the reunification of Germany. Just 2 years before, President Ronald Reagan gave an address at the Brandenburg Gate on June 12, 1987. Listen to what Reagan had to say.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Here to discuss the 35th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall and President Reagan's enduring legacy, I'm really pleased to welcome my guest and good friend, David Trulio. He is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute in Simi Valley, California. David, welcome and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Mr. Speaker, it is great to see you again and a thrill to be on your show. Thank you.
I should mention to our listeners we're just a few days off from that anniversary because both you and I have been traveling quite a bit in the days around the election. I want to set the stage for our listeners who maybe don't remember how incredible this moment in time was. Here is ABC News journalist Peter Jennings reporting live from Berlin on November 10th, 1989.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings, reporting tonight from Berlin.
From the Berlin Wall specifically, take a look at them. They've been there since last night. They are here in the thousands. They are here in the tens of thousands. Occasionally they shout, Die Mauer muss weg, the wall must go. Thousands and thousands of West Germans come to make the point that the wall has suddenly become irrelevant. Something, as you can see, almost to party on. How do you measure such an astonishing moment in history? The East German government said tonight they were going to make more openings in the wall, at least a dozen more, put bulldozers right through the wall so that more people could cross to the west.
David, let's go back in history to the origins of the wall, why it was initially built, and what its purpose was.
Absolutely, Mr. Speaker. Well, on a technical basis, it starts in August of 1961. The wall goes up. And it's important to note that the wall was not to keep the free people of West Berlin in, but to keep the imprisoned people of East Germany and the broader Eastern Bloc out of freedom. And people were escaping to freedom by getting themselves to West Berlin. And that was intolerable in a system that forced control of people down to where they could move and live and so on. So in the dead of night, the East German and Soviet militaries stand up this wall that ends up lasting 28 years before it fell, as you said, Mr. Speaker, on November 9th of 1989.
These German communists were faced with a real crisis because so many people were leaving, that all of their talented folks were leaving. They literally created, in effect, a prison out of the whole country, and yet people continued to tunnel under it and to try to get over it. It seemed to me that it was a remarkable testimony both to the power of freedom and to the evil of tyranny. And yet the Berlin Wall had divided the city of Berlin in half for almost 26 years before Reagan went to Berlin. And he went there to commemorate the 750th anniversary of the city's founding.
It's remarkable. And President Kennedy had been there about a quarter century before. It was 24 years before. Two other U.S. presidents had been there after him. And when President Reagan arrived in June of 1987, Secretary Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, had just been in East Berlin 2 weeks before. So the timing was very interesting and noteworthy. And it was a momentous speech, which I'm sure we'll get into now in a moment.
Well, it became known ultimately as the tear down this wall speech, but that wasn't how it started. And except for Reagan personally, that isn't how it would have ended. Talk a little bit about the dynamics of this bold challenge, which, by the way, related to something Reagan had said when he was governor of California, and he visited Berlin, I believe it was in 1967, and he looked up and he said, "That wall sure is ugly. They ought to tear it down." And so I think he'd had that in the back of his head for all those years, and now was a chance to do something. Could you talk a little bit about the drama? I mean, this thing almost didn't get said.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's a very perceptive point that you make, because the most famous phrase, arguably, of Ronald Reagan, and one of the most important phrases of the entire Cold War, was almost not said. And part of that, or the big driver of that, was a huge debate within President Reagan's team over whether or not that line was an advisable thing to say. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. It was viewed as something to be removed by the State Department, by the National Security Council staff, and including the great Secretary of State, George Shultz, and at the time, Deputy National Security Advisor Colin Powell, another great American. But history has shown that they were wrong. But they kept taking the line out, and the line kept going back in at the behest of the president himself. After all, he was the president and he was their boss. And of course, there was help from the speechwriters, Peter Robinson and Tony Dolan. I think there's a huge implication for today, or for any president, Mr. Speaker, whereby the direction of the boss, whoever that is, really needs to carry the day. And also there'll be an inevitable, perhaps, timidity or a desire to maybe not offend, and calling people out, people who are either engaged in wrongdoing or proclaim, as General Secretary Gorbachev did, that this was a new era of openness or restructuring. Ronald Reagan called him out. And it's interesting, Mr. Speaker, Ronald Reagan didn't say, "Would you please take down this wall?" or, "Hey, we'd really like it if you take down this wall." This was a demand. He demanded that Gorbachev tear down the wall. So as Will Imboden, who wrote a magnificent book, The Peacemaker, details really wonderfully, this is one of the two most powerful men in the world talking to the other most powerful man in the world, and he's issuing this demand, and it's an incredible moment. And that's why we're still talking about it today, and people will talk about it 100 years from now.
He's issuing the demand very publicly. It's also in a classic sense of Reagan's skills. Tear down this wall is a great line. You can imagine, had the normal State Department speechwriters gotten away with it, it would become so indirect, so obscure, so timid that it would have had no meaning.
Well, Will Imboden, who I just mentioned, he cites in his book how as some of the comments as they were soliciting and working through comments. So the Germans are not a sentimental people. They won't like this. This seems silly as edited. That was another piece of feedback. Too much emphasis on good guys and bad guys. And you can just see the sort of timidity of the bureaucracy at work. Now, at the same time, I think, in my opinion, there was a legitimate concern that Ronald Reagan, maybe he shouldn't challenge Gorbachev too directly and risk weakening the Soviet leader who was on a good trajectory. Or maybe it'll upset the Allies. Maybe it could raise false hopes, right? All the reasons not to do something bold. But obviously, history has proven that it was the right thing to do. And it not only electrified the audience in person, but it showed that Ronald Reagan and America stood with the people of Berlin, people who were yearning for freedom everywhere, and he was speaking to them. He was challenging Gorbachev, calling him out on the talk of openness and restructuring. Reagan gave hope to captive nations through moral clarity. And as Secretary Shultz subsequently said, it was a statement beyond the wall that the system had to change. So change it, Gorbachev.
Secretary Shultz told me one time that Reagan had put this line in, and it went over to state, and the state bureaucrats took it out. And he hand wrote it back in and went over to state, and they took it out. And he finally called Shultz and said, "Georgie, you need to tell them I am the president, they're not the president, it stays in. Then they get to Berlin, and that morning at breakfast, every senior advisor begs him to take it out. And on the car on the way to deliver the speech, Ken Duberstein, who became his chief of staff, said, "Are you really, really sure you want to do this?" The level of personal focus and personal strength that Reagan had to exhibit just to get that simple line is amazing. But I always tell people that Reagan had a unique knack. Most of the time, he was at 50,000 feet looking at grand policy, unless he thought there was a point of leverage that required him to go at it. And I think Reagan had this deep, intuitive sense. But at the same time, as you know very well, Reagan also had an acute sense of the importance of backing up words with strength. And I think one of the most interesting examples was his initiative on the Strategic Defense Initiative. Can you talk a little bit about what became ultimately derided by the left and called Star Wars, but in fact was a very serious effort to find a way to minimize the danger of nuclear war? How do you see all that?
Absolutely crucial. So the Strategic Defense Initiative, often referred to as SDI, and then derided by critics such as Ted Kennedy, dismissed as Star Wars, some fantastical thing from a science fiction movie that can never happen, was a groundbreaking initiative with the ultimate objective of intercepting and destroying nuclear missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies. And it had the potential to make nuclear weapons obsolete. And this was a concept, an idea that President Reagan advanced very publicly in 1983. And crucially, he stuck to it. As you know as well as anybody, Mr. Speaker, many in the United States dismissed it on scientific grounds. It could never happen. Allies and partners of the United States, good allies, thought if you pull this off, which many of us don't think you actually can technologically, is this going to delatch you from Europe? Are our interests going to diverge? But President Reagan understood, well, first of all, he hated the concept of nuclear war. He hated the concept that we had lived under of mutually assured destruction, MAD. And he wanted to find a way to fundamentally change the game around that. And more broadly, he saw the possibility that American technology and ingenuity could nullify Soviet advantages. So he had the vision for this, and he held really firm to it. Again, as we discussed earlier, he was able to withstand internal critics, external critics, and it would have been the easiest thing in the world, especially at the Reykjavik summit, to trade away SDI for other nuclear reductions, but he stuck with it. And that played a crucial role in the ultimate defeat of the Soviet Union, because the Soviets, unlike those in the West, actually thought this thing might actually work. They had such healthy respect for American technology and ingenuity that they essentially thought, hey, the Americans might actually pull this off, which meant that they had to spend more and more time and money, pour that into their military, which ultimately was unsustainable for them.
The fact is that Reagan had a very subtle vision of the power of technology, partly, I suspect, from the 8 years he spent at General Electric. He really did have some sense for that. But in addition, he had the huge advantage that he had two partners in Margaret Thatcher and St. John Paul II. Cliff and I did a movie on Reagan called Run to Your Destiny, and then we did a movie on John Paul II called 9 Days That Changed the World. And this magic moment when they get together for the first time, they've both been shot. Then they both were professional actors. John Paul was an actor before he became a priest. They're sitting here, getting to know each other, comparing notes on being actors, and then comparing notes on why did God save their lives. And they concluded that it was to enable them to defeat the Soviet Empire. When you added Thatcher to that, the three of them had a clear purpose, which was to accelerate the disintegration of the Soviet Union. The three of them formed just sort of a remarkable team. And part of that, and you capture this in the library, which I should say to all of our listeners, if you have never been to the Reagan Library, it captures the spirit of Ronald and Nancy Reagan. It's elegant. It's well thought out. You will find it totally fascinating. David does a great job, and his team does, and it's just a remarkable place to learn American history. But part of what I think you learn there is how pleasantly but firmly Reagan pursued a handful of big things. He pursued the defeat of the Soviet Empire. He pursued rebuilding the American economy, something we have to talk about briefly. And then he pursued renewing Americans' faith in themselves and the whole idea of social value of being an American. How does it feel for you to be the director and to walk around and to be in that building and be surrounded by that extraordinary history?
Well, it's an honor of a lifetime, Mr. Speaker, and I'm 50 years old. I was 6 years old when Ronald Reagan was elected. I was 14 when he left office. I had the tremendous privilege of growing up with Ronald Reagan as the president in my most formative years. So I feel a tremendous sense of responsibility, but also passion to share with others those timeless principles, everything from individual liberty to economic opportunity to freedom and democracy, peace through strength and national pride. That is really tremendously motivating. And I appreciate your kind words about the Reagan Library here in Simi Valley. We're only an hour from LAX, and we are the most visited presidential library for a variety of reasons. The compelling history, the amazing man, and of course, Mrs. Reagan, First Lady Nancy Reagan, and the timeless principles. So it's a really remarkable experience.
There's also a kind of beauty that I suspect one has to attribute a good bit of it to Nancy, but there's just a sense of really being elegant that suffuses the entire Reagan experience.
Well, I appreciate that. It's elegant. I emphatically agree with you. It is elegant. It is also relaxed in the sense that it's in a Spanish mission style of architecture. It's evocative of the West, and it really reflects the simultaneous grandeur and humility of the man. And it's really powerful.
We're not going to replace Reagan as a person, but as you look at his policies and his strategies and how he set about to achieve things, what do you think are the lessons the new administration can learn?
Oh, there are tremendous lessons that are truly timeless. First of all, the fundamental commitment to peace through strength. I think we're on a very good footing there with President-elect Trump, where it's clear that he believes in strength. So peace through strength as a timeless, enduring principle is really crucial. Obviously, economic opportunity and really making sure that America is economically competitive. In my opinion, Mr. Speaker, we don't have enough in our national conversation a discussion about the interplay between economic strength and security. You cannot have a strong national security if you don't have a strong economy. And if you don't have strong security, you're not going to have a strong economy for very long. So that interplay is absolutely crucial. And President Reagan fundamentally understood that through economic pressure, we would force the hand of the Soviet Union. Basically, it would ultimately have to choose between bankruptcy and surrender because we were imposing unsustainable costs on them. And as we look to the present time, look at the similarities from back then to today. We had inflation and a really tough economy for so many Americans. We're facing competition from a ruthless communist regime with global reach and ambition. Back then, it was the Soviet Union. Today, it's the People's Republic of China, led by the Chinese Communist Party. By the way, the Reagan Library, we're sanctioned by the People's Republic of China because we dared to host Speaker Kevin McCarthy and President Tsai of Taiwan last year. They didn't like that. So no trips to the People's Republic of China for me, but we wear that as a badge of honor.
What does it mean to be sanctioned by the Chinese Communist Party?
Well, we get kind of a kick out of it. It's not entirely clear. What I can guarantee you is that if I were to apply to get a visa to visit China, it will either get denied or if it's approved, I'd probably, at the very least, expect to have a very long and uncomfortable time at the airport were I to land inside the borders of the People's Republic of China as currently ruled by the Chinese Communist Party. It probably means we're not going to get the terracotta warriors, is my guess. We're a leading cultural institution. We have special exhibitions all the time. By the way, we're about to host, starting next week for many months, the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the most significant archaeological discovery of the last 80 years will be here at the Reagan Library. But I don't expect that we'll have anything coming out of the PRC.
Walk us through this exhibit.
Absolutely. So we are a leading cultural institution. So in addition to the amazing museum dedicated to the life and presidency of Ronald Reagan and First Lady Nancy Reagan, we are actually launching a new exhibition starting at the end of next week that is going to display the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we invite the public to journey through time and explore one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. They're coming to the United States after nearly a decade. It features 8 authentic Dead Sea Scrolls and over 200 artifacts from the Second Temple period. So it's a really remarkable exhibition. It's the world premiere and the only West Coast venue, if anybody would like to see them. So I invite you and Callista and all of your listeners to embark on what I think is a really unforgettable journey through history. And it starts Friday of next week.
How much of what you do nowadays is online so people can access it from all over the world?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Speaker. It is a huge part of what we do. We will always be world-class at the in-person experience. The special exhibition I just mentioned, the amazing speakers that we get to host in person. We hosted you back in January, you and Callista, and it was wonderful, and it was a packed house. In a nation of 330 plus million people, we need to reach them, and we are reaching them through our social media reach. So whether it's at Ronald Reagan on X or at Reagan Foundation on YouTube and Instagram, we're reaching literally millions of people with content rooted in President Reagan's legacy and principles. And that's super exciting because we're pursuing parallel tracks with an amazing in-person experience with a tremendous online presence as well. And that includes our educational programs. We're reaching tens of thousands of young people, middle, high school, and college people through our variety of educational programs, our national oratory competition, for example, our scholarships, and so on. And all that can be found on reaganfoundation.org/education.
It is a remarkable place. And of course, you have, I think, one of the dream jobs in American politics. You get to be in a beautiful place, dealing with a remarkable couple and helping not just the Americans, but people around the world have a better sense of why Reaganism worked, what it was all about. And I think in particular, I'm really hopeful that President Trump and his team will look at how Reagan got his 3-year tax cut through. Because I was there, I was part of it. I'd worked with Jack Kemp to develop supply-side economics and to develop a 3-year tax cut. But we were a minority. We had to have Democratic votes. And Reagan did just an amazing job of turning this into a national American issue, not a Republican issue. And as a result, he got the changes he needed in regulations and the changes he needed in taxation, and he launched what became about 25 years of prosperity in a way that is really, really remarkable. Every time I get a chance to come out there, I'm reminded that he literally changed history. He changed economic history. He changed how we felt about ourselves, and he was the key to liberating the Russian people and all of Eastern Europe from the Soviet Union. So you have a national treasure in the museum, and I really appreciate your taking the time to be with us and to talk about this. Our listeners can learn more about the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute by visiting your website at reaganfoundation.org. And if you live in California or if you're going to visit Southern California, you really have to go see the Reagan Library in Simi Valley. It is a remarkable institution. And I want to thank you, David, for taking this kind of time to be with us.
Thrilled to be here, and my thanks right back at you, Mr. Speaker. Thanks for all that you're doing and for this time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you to my guest, David Trulio. You can get a link to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Pendley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.